everyone, and welcome to God's Plan, Your Part, a podcast where our goal is to read the entire Bible in a year, seeking to understand God's plan of redemption while discovering daily and practically your part in it.
Hey everybody, welcome back. Today we are jumping into Matthew 16, Mark 8, and Luke 9, verses 18 to 27. So there are some interesting things in here. There's some confusing comments about bread. The poor disciples don't quite get that Jesus is kind of making a figurative statement. There is this really interesting thing where they go to Caesarea Philippi, and Peter proclaims that Jesus is the Christ. And then shortly after that, Jesus proclaims that Peter is Satan. So there's a lot to cover here, and there's a lot of interesting things to get out of this reading.
So we see Jesus throughout a lot of these chapters kind of like defending who he is. So there are conversations that he's having with the Pharisees and the Sadducees who are doubting him again. And basically like begging him for a sign in Matthew 16, like, hey, tell us who you are. And Jesus is just like, hey, you can look at the sky and you can predict what's coming, but here I am, like right in front of you, telling you who I am. You've seen the miracles that I've performed and you still don't believe. So like your sign is going to be the sign of Jonah. Reference to Jesus when he dies and is put into the grave and rises after 3 days, same as Jonah was in the whale, or the big fish, excuse me. And he is spit out after 3 days. So he's like, you know what? You've the sign of Jonah. I know who I am. You know who I am. You're just rejecting me. And so he defends himself in that way. And then we also see Jesus kind of like defending, not necessarily defending himself to the disciples, but like, he's like, well, who do you think that I am? Like, everybody's saying that I'm somebody else. Who do you say that I am? So it's like this weird identity crisis that a lot of people are having with Jesus.
This is one of those things that you miss if you experience the Bible out of context. So if your primary experience with the Bible is like whatever your pastor has to say on Sunday morning, your pastor is just doing what he can to teach you a text, but you're not going to read through the whole story on a Sunday morning, most likely. And so what's interesting here is that when the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the scribes are begging Jesus for a sign, out of context, it feels like, oh, that's interesting. They're just having a conversation with Jesus. What's crazy is that they have seen so many signs.
Yep.
They've seen so many signs. So when Jesus tells them that the only sign they're going to get is the sign of Jonah, it's not totally fair because Jesus is literally well known for healing people, for casting out demons. He just finished feeding 5,000 people with very little loaves and fish, and then 4,000 people with very little loaves and fish. So there's literally signs everywhere. And what's interesting about this little story is that what you said earlier, they just refuse to believe. Like they're literally always just asking for one more thing, and Jesus is just pointing out how hard their hearts are.
Mm-hmm. Well, also, I think they're trying to test him too. They're trying to corner him. It just doesn't work. Something else that we see that you kind of alluded to at the beginning was each of these readings taps into the conversation between Jesus and the disciples about him foreshadowing his death. And I guess in a way, he's kind of foreshadowed his death as well with the conversation with the Sadducees saying, hey, your sign is the sign of Jonah. But he's telling them that, I'm going to die, I'm going to be killed, and on the third day, I'm going to be raised.
Exactly.
And the disciples, I don't think I've ever like taken their perspective into consideration. I think being a disciple, if that would have been me in their shoes, stupid thought, but whatever. I'm not sure that I would even entertain the idea of like, oh yeah, Jesus is definitely going to be killed. Like, no, he's my friend.
Yeah.
He's my teacher. Like, I'm following him. I'm excited to learn from him. I can't wait to see where things go in my life because of him being in it. And I don't know that they necessarily were like totally coming to grips with actual reality or like wanting to like live outside of denial. Like, no way, you're not going to die. Would you stop it? And Jesus is just straight up with them. No, this is going to happen. And you need to like be ready for that. And I think Peter's like, no, like that's never going to happen to you, Jesus. What are you talking about? And in so doing prompts Jesus to say this, get behind me, Satan, like calling out his thoughts and his insecurities, his feelings about, no, that's not what I want. But Jesus is saying, like, it's the will of God. It's going to happen. Shut up. Get behind me, Satan.
This is another case that has been slowly building. Like, the disciples have been following Jesus for some time at this point, and Jesus has been pretty coy about who he is. Like, he does these miracles, he does these signs. Sometimes he tells people to not tell anybody about what's going on.
Yeah.
But you see kind of Jesus being more and more open with the disciples about who he is. And at the end of Matthew 16, we get some of the most pointed language about who he is. Jesus is literally starting to unveil, like, I'm going to go and I'm going to suffer and then I'm going to die. And that's probably the most pointed he's been with them, which causes like this visceral reaction from them. They're like, no, we don't want that to happen, just like you're saying.
Mm-hmm.
And Jesus makes this point that if you're going to follow me, you have to desire what God wants and not what you want. And that has been, like, throughout Christian history, it has been a defining mark of what a real disciple is, of what a real Christian looks like. There's so many people throughout history that have desired in a deep way what God desires above and beyond their own lives. And some people could even make the case that those people are very foolish. Like, they desire God's kingdom so much, they do it like at the risk of their own lives, and the world has decided they are pretty crazy.
Well, I think it's really obvious too at the end of Matthew 16, when Jesus kind of sums up that little section about his death. He says, "For you are not setting your mind on the things of God, but the things of man." I think alluding to, like, you're not thinking about God's plan, you're thinking about yours. And immediately after that is when Jesus is talking about taking up your cross. And if you think of any lasting impact story that you have heard of the Lord working in someone's life, it is typically not because things went the way that we thought they should. It's because we humbled ourselves and realized, nope, it's God's plan, not mine. He is going to be glorified through his plan and not what I want. So I think that's pretty interesting that is the follow-up conversation or part in this text.
Also keep in mind that this is Jesus saying, take up your cross and follow me, before anybody knew he would literally take up his cross and go and be crucified. So that's another thing that I think we tend to experience out of context. You hear that verse and you think, oh yeah, carry your cross just like Jesus. But nobody he was speaking to would have thought that. That would have struck people as kind of odd. Yeah. Like, take up your cross. Like, why? That's like take up your electric chair or take up your lethal injection.
Yeah,
like, it's
weird.
kind of strange. But it is kind of this like violent death of yourself. And so this is a very powerful almost prophecy from Jesus that is, I will be taking up my cross. And I don't know that most of them notice that.
I think that also requires extreme faith from these men too, because that is something that we so easily forget. They had no idea what would actually, Jesus alluded to things, but they didn't know that's what was actually going to happen. And the closer and closer they got, I think the more they realized, oh my word, this is going down. So I don't know, that kind of faith is hopefully a mirror to us of what you were saying, just completely die to yourself and realize that God's plan is what needs to happen and not our own.
And when you die to yourself in the consumeristic culture that we live in, you're going to look insane. You're going to look very different, because everything, including a lot of Christian circles and a lot of churches, want you to find what's best for you. And Jesus says, forget what's best for you. Always do what's best for me. Mm-hmm. And that is a radical way of life, but it is a life where Jesus promised us the most reward. So I think that's the easier part for today. Are you actually living for God, or are you living for yourself and putting a God stamp on it? Because that's still just living for yourself. Mm-hmm. We need to truly, truly seek a way to live for God. There is some extra credit in here. We kind of got ahead of ourselves a little bit. Peter does this incredible confession of who Jesus is. Actually, I think it's in verse, what is it? It's in verse 16, I think. It's in verse 16 of chapter 16 of Matthew. Simon Peter says that Jesus is the Son of the living God. It's the first time we hear this. And then by verse 23, by verse 23, Jesus is calling him Satan. So Peter has this extreme up and down moment. But Jesus takes the disciples to Caesarea Philippi to ask them this question and to kind of confront what they believe about him. And there's this sort of controversial statement about Peter that on this rock I will build my church. This is one of those instances where if you don't understand the context of the area, the layout of the land, or if you don't understand the city, you're going to miss out significantly, because Caesarea Philippi is probably one of the darkest places in that land at that time. You can still go visit Caesarea Philippi. It's this place of like idol worship. It's pretty sketchy. There's actually like carved out half circle, kind of half moon things in the rock where idols would have sat and people would have worshipped. But also in the middle of the rock is this big like mouth of a cave where a river runs out, and they called that place the gates of hell. People believed that that was the entrance to hell, and a lot of times they would sacrifice human beings and throw them in the river to whatever idols they were worshiping, and they believed that the gods were not satisfied until the dead body floated back into the mouth of the cave. And if you know anything about how rivers flow and how things float, they don't float upstream.
Gross.
So Jesus most likely took his disciples to this area while these things were still being practiced. If they weren't still being practiced, it was at least in their recent memory that they were. And so being Jews, and actually yesterday we talked about the importance of being clean and trying to stay away from being unclean. This would have been a very nasty place where people were not allowed to go, because there was a lot of idolatry, there was a lot of death, there was a lot of uncleanliness. And so Jesus takes his disciples almost on a field trip for an object lesson about how powerful his kingdom will be. And when his kingdom is built on this rock, the gates of hell, remember the literal gates of hell, because that's what they called the place, would not be able to prevail against his church, his kingdom. They wouldn't be able to prevail against the rock. And so Jesus is taking his disciples to the darkest place he can think of to tell them about how powerful he is and how powerful God's plan is, in that there is redemption even for the most evil people they could imagine at the time. So the story's pretty incredible. I knew nothing about that story until my professor taught me about it standing in Caesarea Philippi. So it's a really powerful visual to see where Jesus was standing and what Jesus was teaching. He is speaking directly to the disciples about exactly what's in front of their eyes. And so to me, it's just encouraging to think about how powerful God's kingdom is, to think about how powerful his plan is, and how it is bound to overcome the most evil thing you can imagine. And it will do that. So I hope you're encouraged today. I hope that you are seeking God's kingdom, not your own. And we'll be back again tomorrow. We'll see you then. Also, if you are tracking with us day by day, we apologize that this episode is out extremely late. It's actually a whole day late. If you have been with us for a while, you know that we are constantly fighting with our soundboard because sometimes it actually records our work and sometimes it doesn't. So yesterday it did not record our work. So we're a little bit behind, but we will be caught up quickly. So we'll be back in tomorrow. We'll see you then.
Thanks so much for listening to God's Plan, Your Part. If anything stuck out to you, if you have any questions, or if you'd like to receive a Bible, you can email us at godsplanyourpart@gmail.com. Also, if you're enjoying the podcast, please consider supporting us through the link in our description. We love that you're on this journey with us, and we hope you have a great day. See you tomorrow.